Hello, it's Hamish here from my Airbnb in the UK where I'm staying, and I'm coming to you from East Putney on the morning of Sunday. I think it must be something like the 19th, the 18th or the 19th. And this is the first of a number of blogs that I'd like to record here while I'm on this amazing trip around the UK, looking at a range of geolocative projects, geolocative audio projects that are going on in and around exciting places that have stories. And of course, storied places is key to my heart. I've got a website called storiedland.com, and this is what excites me at this point in time, with the combination of digital culture, the ability now to locate stories on location, to walk in and out of those stories, and how those stories are fashioned, how people are approaching these. So it's going to be a little bit of a journey, this blog. And I'd just like to start off, first of all, by thanking Arts Queensland and also all my friends and family for the support and helping me get here. Without you guys, this would have never been possible. So it's a real honor to be here. And this is, I guess, me wanting to seriously reflect on some of the stuff that I'm finding out here. As I said, this is the first blog that I'll be doing on this subject, and I'm still a bit of a newbie to Facebook live streaming, though this is actually not live because I'm getting this into a private file and then I'll put this up later. But suffice to say that I'm figuring this out, and I was asking myself over the last few days what I was actually going to do with this document, with this ostensibly live streaming exercise, whether it was a review of the geolocative projects that I'm doing, whether it's discussing just what I'm finding and the things that it's stirring up in me as someone who's come from this direction, or whether it's just a big long chat fest. And I've decided that it's really not. It's not about doing a review of any one geolocative app. It doesn't seem fair. I feel very conscious that there's often a lot that have gone into these projects, and I'm not quite sure what license I have to kind of come along and review and critique these as if I'm some sort of ultimate measure of these. But I do think that there's going to be, I've got to discuss how this process was for me and whether or not it worked, and what I got out of this process, and hopefully that's a positive thing all round. So I'll try to tread gently, but I also want to tread enthusiastically and honestly. So today I'm looking at the Cartographer's Confession. The Cartographer's Confession was a project that was undertaken by Ambient Literature, which I understand is a collaboration between a number of universities, and also it had arts funding as well here in the UK. And I believe that they've undertaken around six projects altogether, and the Cartographer's Confession is one of those projects. And I was taken by the Cartographer's Confession because the thing that it is doing is it's really exploring the way in which narrative and storytelling is woven across the country. And in this case, it's set around the banks of the River Thames here in London. And when Ambient Literature were commissioning people to produce a range of geolocative projects or geolocative storytelling projects, their idea is that they're looking at ways in which people are increasingly looking to digital culture, and particularly mobile phones, as ways to intersect with stories, and how those stories might be built, what the architecture of those stories might be, but particularly what that storytelling experience will be on the ground through a mobile phone. And for me, having come from a background of creative writing and then having moved into radio, and with a love of place-based storytelling, I was very curious about the Cartographer's Confession, because I thought that first I'll just tell you that Ambient Literature commissioned the beautiful writer James Attlee, who lives just out of London, to undertake to produce a project. And James came and met with me the other day, just after I'd finished the last leg of the Cartographer's Confession. So we had a great 3-hour meeting talking about how the process had been for him. And so that's what I'm doing today. I'm really saying this is one of the first of the number of projects that I'll be looking at on my travels through around the south of England, and I think this is a goodie. This is a really important project. This is a project that I think has a lot to contribute to the field of geolocative audio storytelling. Now, I'm using the word audio here with a little bit of license, because a project like the Cartographer's Confession is quite a complex mix of different elements. It has letters that pop up as you're walking along. It has photos, and it has a range of different, a couple of sort of narratives. But the upshot of it is it's really about a man's story to try to discover what happened to his mother. And it's a work of fiction that arose out of James, a range of photographs that James had come across, family photographs that depicted people post-war in London, around the river district. And from that, he built this story called the Cartographer's Confession. And I suppose you kind of have to wonder why you would attempt something like the Cartographer's Confession through a digital format as opposed to a novel. So James is a writer. I think he's a good writer. Not that it's for me to judge here particularly. I'm really talking about the Ambient Literature project. But his writing really shines when you're walking around. So the project starts off outside the Tate Modern, right on the banks of the river. And it starts off with this fairly seasoned sort of voice of a man who's got a lovely kind of vernacular, and he's talking about the process of his mother and him arriving from Norway shortly after the Second World War. And we're aware that they're refugees and they've come through a processing sort of immigration processing situation on the docks. And so I guess we're kind of brought into this world of new arrivals here in this city that's been an absolute hub for people arriving from all around the world. So the first thing that strikes me about the Cartographer's Confession when I was doing it was the beauty of the writing. I was really brought into this man's world, and I found I became quite invested in the character in ways that really reminded me of having done a few chapters of a novel, and you're kind of in there, and you've decided, yep, you're going to give this one a go. And I found myself fairly quickly sort of pulled into the story of a man and his mother and the complex situation that she found herself in the post-war years, where she had been with a German man prior to the war in Norway, and she'd fallen pregnant. And then the Germans invaded Norway. And so she was seen, they lived in occupied Norway, and then she was seen, as colluding with the occupiers. And then the war finished, and the Norway people, were able to liberate themselves, and she was seen very much as having, conspired with the enemy, and things just became almost impossible at that point. And so she decided to escape not only her German partner, who had always been very pro-Hitler, much to her surprise. So she took off. She took off really out of concern for her own and her child's safety through to London, where she knew she could start again. And so this voice of this man who's talking about his memories of coming to the docks here in London City, amidst the wreckage and carnage of the Second World War, after the Second World War, where the city's obviously scarred and bruised and pitted, and they're trying to make their lives here as new immigrants, while everyone's probably in post-war shock, and therein begins this rich and complex, I think, story that has some really interesting twists and turns. So I'd never really understood what it might be like to try to transfer, something like a novel through to a geolocative experience. I come obviously from a background with sound trails, working in Australia, which is perhaps taking a more standard approach with the idea of stories on location. And while I say standard, I don't mean that they're easy, because I think the stories that we've done with sound trails, did I say sound trails or storyland? Sound trails. This is our project in Australia is sound trails, and but I think the formula that we have used with sound trails is perhaps a more well-trodden route, and that's one where the stories of the people or the place lift up and speak to you as a document of that place, of those people, and I mean, they're beautifully produced stories, but they're working within a cultural tourism, for the lack of a better word, sort of genre. The Cartographer's Confession, however, is really looking at how the digital framework, the mobile digital framework, might work to facilitate a similar type of experience of a fiction, in this case, that's placed on country. And so we have this highly crafted narrative story that brings in a range of different elements. And I was curious to see how they might do this. It was recommended to me by Joe Reed from Kelvium, who are leading app producers here in the UK. And Joe said this was one of the leading projects. So I was very, very curious to do this off the bat when I got here. It took me 3 days to do it. There were a couple of glitches with the process, and they did make it more difficult for me. One of the glitches was that for some reason GPS, the little cursor, did not kick up on the app. So as I was walking around the streets of London, trying to find where these stories were, there was no way that I had of being able to see where I was on the streets. And so I had to shuttle back and forth sometimes to Google Maps where the cursor was working. A little issue. And there were a couple of other things, but I don't really want to overstate those issues at the moment. And as I said, I don't really see it as my job to critique these apps so much as to sort of explore what they're doing and what we can get from these experiences collectively to look at how we might build a more beautifully layered, storied world around us, because it's, I think, a really powerful moment where we're at with the placement of creative stories, whether they're fiction or non-fiction, back onto country. I think it's a remarkable time, and I don't think many people have cottoned on to just what this means in terms of the scripting, the choreographing, the architecture, and the whole storytelling narrative experience when it comes to being immersed in a story, voices, sounds, songs, music that have some really strong resonance with a location. It is orality in a fairly old form delivered through a very modern system. And I think it's shifting from its training wheels now through to a fairly serious sort of mountain bike, where projects like, well, I think Sound Trails is doing it. I think it is delivering it. And certainly the Cartographer's Confession, I think what they're doing is really impressive. So where do I go now? I'm not quite sure. I decided not to script this too much in case I was getting too anxious about it, about what I was saying. I'm really going to have to just figure this out as I go. The second thing that really struck me about the Cartographer's Confession was the degree of production that's gone into the sound design, and it rocks. It really rocks. It's the River Thames, it's tugboats, it's lapping water, it's seagulls, it's scrunching paper, it's the clip of horses. It's a rich, vibrant post-war soundscape. And written into this, or played into this, is this beautiful beautiful music mix that I believe some very accomplished musicians have done in Bristol, and the audio in these projects, the audio in something like the Cartographer's Confession, to me, it's joyous. It's one of the things that I think really reminds me of why many of my colleagues in radio land or podcast land, they're not getting it yet. That when you layer stories that are written across country, and you've got sound, you've got time, as in where you're walking and the amount of time it might take to get from one place, or the amount of time it might take for a story to tell, and you've got this intersection with place, and of course in a city like London, which is just so layered with different places and corners and architecture and communities and waves of migration. I mean, place is just dripping here with stories and experiences and people's lives and tragedy and loss, and it's humanity sort of writ large here. So when you place audio into that mix, then something changes. And I think the producers of the Cartographer's Confession really sort of got this. They got that this is a long ambulation through one of the world's richest sort of sites, with this extraordinary story of a mother and child, where the grown man, is really trying to piece together what happened to his mother. And so it starts off at the Tate Modern, then it goes to the Borough Markets, which is where he and his mother lived, and there's a range of really extraordinary photographs that I think James uses to maximum potential. And one of them is with this guy called Benny, who was, I think he was an Italian, and he used to be a street performer with a monkey. And of course, there were probably many people like Benny around places like the Borough Markets just after the war. And so our main character called Thomas, and his mum fall in with Benny, and it's a fairly sort of hand-to-mouth existence for all of them, and then the mother disappears. She just disappears, and the man's piecing it together, and we're piecing it together. So I guess it's a sort of a I wouldn't say it's a coming of age story, but it's a what happened to mum story from the perspective of the man. And meanwhile, kind of interfacing in with this story is this this kind of notion that there's a cartographer, and someone's become a cartographer who's fascinated by maps. And at the same time, there's these narratives around the stories of birds, and the migration of birds, and one particularly unseasonably cold winter, where many birds were likely to perish, and they were unable to cross the Alps, and so it I guess it sort of weaves in this idea of migration and the likelihood of death, and also the spirit of human generosity that surrounds the story and the birds. So the story starts off at the Tate Modern. It then moves through to the Borough Markets, and then it goes over to the north side of the river. You have to catch your tube, and And I have to say, when I first started doing this, it was my first day proper in London. I've never been to London before. And I was struggling with the sheer volume of people around places like the Tate Modern. I'd come from a town of 15,000 people, 2 hours north of, the capital city in Queensland, Australia. And here I am, in the hubris of people and bodies and tourists, and everyone seems to be wheeling and dealing. And when I put the headphones on, I found it was an enormous relief. I found that I was able to negotiate the crowd and the routes and the walking and the demands that were sort of placed on me much more readily. It was like I went into a bubble. And I think part of this is the incredible music that kind of carries us through this journey. And the great thing is James is a musician, and I'm not quite sure what James plays, but there's this haunting trumpet that is throughout the experience, and it really works. The music really rocks. It's got a gritty, effective, post-war, on the streets sort of feel to it that's got a real rhythm to it. And I think that rhythm is really important, I think, when you're asking people to travel with you. And the Cartographer's Confession is quite an ask. James, James suggests to me that it's 4 hours. It took me 3 half days, but I think partly that was because I was a complete newbie to London, and I was finding my way around the city at the same time, and I'd often segue off and discover little bits and pieces. And the great thing was that the music carried me. I was able to stay in that music, but when I came back to those locations, then I knew that was where the stories were taking place. And so I could find myself a nice little perch and kick up the stories. Now I'm going to say this again because I think I've said this. This is the third time. So it starts off at the Tate Modern. It goes to the borough markets. Then it heads over to the north side, I think to Regent's Park and to Leicester Square. And I know that there was Shakespeare's statue in there. But as I said, I'm still not really familiar with where I was. I knew she was going to ring. And then it comes back to the south side again. And I have to say, when I got out of the city at the end, when I got out, slightly out of the city, just away from the city at the last part, which is, I think it's on the southeastern side of London City, and it's round the Norwegian sector where they had a Norwegian church, and I think it was where the Norwegian community had come around the time of the war. I loved it. I loved that place. It was a beautiful day. There was this really intimate series of stories around that, and the ending was, I think, really a kick-ass little ending. Now, I've read many novels in my time, and I'm aware that there's some novels I'll pick up and I'll put down pretty quickly. For me, this was up there with a really good novel. It had texture. It was beautifully crafted. It wasn't overly laboured. The actor who was doing Thomas's voice really carried it off, and I think there's a lot in that. There's a lot of skill involved in understanding not only the way in which people are going to be interfacing with this, but that this is an auditory experience. And I think people who have a background in radio broadcasting and documentary making, they really get this. And arguably, some of the really top podcasts, they're getting this. But the canvas here for storytelling is vaster. It's vaster. It's more sophisticated. It carries, I think, the potential for a much richer, immersive storytelling experience than anything I've experienced before. And I'm really excited about that. And I'm really excited to be able to talk about this. And hopefully someone who's coming into this down the track might get something from what I'm talking about here. To know that I can walk down the road and I can go to the Tate Modern and I can kick up this app, and then I can walk into this post-Second World War story that draws me into the life of a boy who came here with his mother and had to not only fend for himself, but discover what it was that had happened to his mother, and have this remarkable set of experiences that is so richly layered and so beautifully orchestrated with the music is really something. It's taking, for me, the idea of cultural tourism to a whole new level. It's taking the idea of storytelling into a place where audio really commands a primary place here, because it is audio here which is delivering that voice. It's giving us the timing, it's setting the tonal mood, it's giving us the rhythms by which we sort of move. And I think it's also enunciating something of the sort of the psychic mood of the story and the place. And obviously with a story like The Cartographer's Confession, that place is redolent with mood, and the way in which that story interfaces with that place, and how the music articulates that is really interesting. It's a really interesting proposition. And I think the proposition of asking people to walk, as James said, 4 hours around London, at a pinch, 4 hours around London, and for me, 3.5 days. I kind of, on one hand, it's a big ask, and on the other hand, it's great, because it's sort of saying, okay, well, sort of logic would suggest that people's attention span will be very limited. You'd probably want to limit it to half an hour, 50 minutes, at the most, because people are really strapped for time in London. There's so many things to see and do. But I love the way in which The Cartographer's Confession has sort of flipped that around on its head, and it's saying this story, is going to command this time. And it's your choice whether or not you want to do it. But if you do it, then it's going to slow you down, and it's going to invite you to explore places on the way. And it's something that you can't rush, and you can keep your headphones on when you get when you take the tube from the south side to the north side, and it's going to carry you along the streets of London until you get to those story points. And I like that. I like that it's for me, it's a celebration of the art of listening, and I think that that's the most powerful thing that this process is really doing here. I'm probably less than interested in bells and whistles with these processes. I think that with geolocative audio or geolocative processes. I think it is the story and less so the information and more so the experience that's really capturing us here. So I know that a lot of people are very enamored by the technology, and people are doing things like animating objects and getting them to speak, and you know, I don't know, I haven't really done a lot of that, and I'm sure that, you know, there's real merit in that in terms of animating inanimate objects, but for me, you know, the term virtual, I think, really sort of applies here, because around me when I'm doing the Cartographer's Confession is this rich and real place called London, and then I'm you know, through a mobile device, I'm able to experience something which is layered into that actual location, which is this deeply affective story. And so there's something that goes between the digital and the real tactile world, which I have to say becomes very, very real. It becomes really powerful, and I think that's something that geolocative storytelling can do like nothing else can do, because it is bringing us back to the fact that places are rich with stories, and stories are not just the delivery of information. Stories are timing, stories are voices, their breath, their delivery, their rich, sonorous experiences that are here to draw us in and to make us think and to help us engage with and experience the world around us. So I think this is a really powerful project, and I think that that part of the key to this project has been a number of things. From what I understand from James, it's been a number of things. The first thing, of course, is that Ambient Literature were able to procure the money enough to make this happen, and it sounds like it was a reasonably well-funded project where they had money not only to commission a writer of the caliber of James Attlee, but some world-class musicians and sound producers, and they were able to then build that into an app of sophistication with the help of Calvium. But I think the two things that really strike me here, where the skin is, the skin in the game here, is not only in James's ability to build a story that is a wonderful and powerful and I think quite prescient story around the refugee experience. As a skilled writer, I think, you know, that James is bringing his skill to the fore here, and I don't say that lightly. I think he says enough, but not too much. And I think the fact that it's a fragmentary experience where you piece together these parts of the story that's delivered to you in episodes, I think creates a certain narrative tension that James uses very well to ensure that there's a real thunder and a real kick in, you know, you get a real kick at the end when I think the stories come together in the finish. The other thing I think which is really interesting with the Cartographer's Confession is the relationship between James and the woman called Emma. Now, Emma, forgive me, I'm not sure of your last name. I forget your last name, but Emma was obviously the go-between between James and this bewilderingly complex architecture called a geolocative app, which has a front end and a back end, and it has certain requirements. And someone like Emma obviously is able to go between the developers who are going to say, okay, well, what do you want, and how is the story going to work, and how is it going to operate, and what are the elements that you want to bring into this story. And James, who's riding at the coalface as the producing these wonderful characters and unraveling the story for us. So this is not writing in the novel form as we know it, where you'd write on a page. This is writing through a very specific set of mechanics, really quite a unique architecture. And James has got to be able to kind of work out how that works. He's got to be able to go to the locations and know that his stories will kick up at certain points. He's got to have some sort of control as to the way in which the story is delivered over the place and over time. He's got to figure out basically where that route would be for someone who's doing the cartographer's confession, and how to shape and craft that story in with that. So Emma, for me, has played a really important role in terms of acting as a go-between. And one of the reasons why I say this is because with the work that we've done with Sound Trails is that, we're a much smaller budgeted project. And when we're commissioned to do a piece, we're doing the whole thing. We're doing the whole kit and caboodle from woe to go. And I mean, it just so happens that, I know how to use the back end of the app. I know what the app can do. I know what it can't do. I know where its strengths lies, where its weaknesses are. And to all intents and purposes, I try to avoid going down the technical road with developers when I'm doing the story process, because it's a very different set of requirements to then go into things like, well, coding can do this, or we're using this API, and it's an absolute creative wet blanket basically. So I think Emma, the role that she's played, and I think James said to me something like he termed her role as something like experienced designer. I think that's a really interesting role to play, going between the really rudimentary nuts and bolts requirements of developers who want to know how the system's going to work, what the functionality is, where there might be bugs, and ironing out this whole process, through to a writer who's writing at the interface of kind of the people's experience on the ground with this. And he's meanwhile trying to figure out, what those limitations are and how to frame what he's doing within that. I think that relationship's fascinating. And I'm hopefully going to have a chat to Emma in the next few days about this. So that's possibly not a bad place to sort of maybe pause for thought. Because this is something that I want to do when I'm in the UK, and it's taken me a wee while to kind of work out how to do this technically. I might possibly do some of these blogs as live streams. Otherwise, I'm going to put them up on Storyland. And if you think that there's people out there who are interested in geolocative audio storytelling and they're serious about it, then hopefully they might find a blog like this is just sort of fueling the fire in terms of interest and understanding around the ways that this technology is working today. So let's see how we go with this. Today I'm actually going to go to Battersea, and I'm going to do a probably a more sort of stock standard cultural heritage tour around the old historic site. I don't really know too much about Battersea at the moment. I know it was an old power station, and it's now been I think it's a big, I think there might be a museum and stuff like that. So I know App Furnace have done, sorry, not App Furnace, Calvium have done a project there. So for all of you who've made it through to this point on a YouTube chat, well done. Thank you very much for hanging on in there. I hope you might get something from this, and onwards and upwards. Okay, bye-bye.